Hey everyone, I'm Lion Heathane. Welcome back to Roll for Perspective, a show where I sit down with content creators, GMs, artists, game designers, and more within the TTRPG space to discuss settings, systems, tips, and other insights. For this episode, I'm sitting down with the award-winning Kendo, GM for the
Oh my
award-winning
god.
Tales Get Told podcast.
Thank you. Oh my god.
Oh, so excited. Thank you so much for being here. It is so cool. For those who haven't had the opportunity to like check out your amazing stuff before, I'm totally not biased, by the way.
Of course not. Of course not.
Why don't you take a moment, introduce yourself, and tell us a little bit about you and what you do in the space?
Yeah, so my name is Kendrick or Kendo, whichever you prefer. I use they, he pronouns. You can find me basically everywhere on the internet at Kendo Makes Films. I am the award-winning game master of the award-winning podcast, actual play podcast, Tales Yet Told, where we play indie TTRPGs, exploring dramatic stories with uh, troubled characters in very weird worlds. And I am also one of the hosts and facilitators for the actual play live stream, Prayers in the Static, which is like kind of our break off live stream segment that specifically does sci-fi content. Um, uh, yeah, that's what I do. I mostly play games with people and make them sad. But only so we can be happy at a later point in time.
I mean, that's part of the magic of the storytelling, right? Is we have our
Yeah,
down
right?
points so we can hit our peaks.
Exactly. That's the whole, it's the cycle. You got to roll with it, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. I love that. I love the way you lay that out, by the way. I really do. And it will come up more than once throughout this episode, I'm sure. But I'm definitely
I'm
a big
sure.
fan.
I I truly do appreciate that.
It's such good stuff. Seriously, I'll say this again at the end, but if you haven't checked it out yet, please do check it out.
Check it out. Episodes every other Wednesday or wherever you get your podcatchers or whatever podcatcher you use to get your podcasts
Yeah.
is the better way to say that.
So the first thing I'd like to really get into is what like first brought you into the TTRPG space and what kept you coming back?
Yeah. So I started playing tabletop RPGs at my junior year in high school. I was like actually like almost a decade at this point, if not actually a decade. I started playing Dungeons and Dragons Fourth Edition when my friend Robin in high school she told me about this game. Well, she told me about Dungeons and Dragons and like kind of like introduced the concept to me, and then from there I started watching. What like I guess before like actual play was like really considered a thing, but like the old like videos of like Acquisitions Incorporated at PAX and like all of the other like tangential like there was a video of like them doing like D&D with I want to say it was like Adult Swim people. I can't remember. Chris Perkins GM'd it. This was again like a decade ago. I don't remember it like fully, but like those videos, stuff like that. The Spoonie experiments, Counter Monkey, really got me into like the idea of like sitting down at a table with dice and characters and like
Oh
telling
yeah.
stories with my friends, and I've been doing it ever since. But as far as like my greater like getting into the tabletop like space as like a like community and with people, um, I was on TikTok and just started like making videos and like doing like whatever like trends or whatever that was around like D&D TikTok, TTRPG TikTok. And it's like from there that I started meeting other people finally outside of like my group of friends who mostly I introduced D&D to. And so it was like a breath of fresh air, like getting all of these new perspectives and all these new games. And from there, that's where I like started finding my love of like indie tabletop RPGs and like trying out all of these new experiences and new games. And I had to get a whole new bookcase to fit
Oh,
all of my games back when it
glorious.
was literally just all of these D&D books on this bottom one, and now it's slowly filling out with more and more games.
I am so absolutely jealous of it. I only have so much space, so I have PDFs for everything.
Oh yes.
There's nothing like having the books though. Oh man, so nice.
Honestly, like yeah, I one of my favorite things is like when books have like, when they have like a hardcover, soft cover, like physical copy, but it also comes with a PDF,
Yes.
like folders full of them. Really, I just like being able to hold the books. I don't even really use them all that much. I just like having them. It's weird. I There was a long period of time where I didn't understand like people who liked to collect things, like
Sure.
because there was a part of me that was just like, it's just a thing. What are you doing with it? Well, now I've become that person where I just collect TTRPGs, I guess.
Yeah. I think for me at least, it's very much a like texture thing. There's something
Yeah,
about the way that the book actually feels. But I'm with you. I don't even for the books I have. I don't use them because it's so much easier to open the PDF. Either you
right.
have it like bookmarked already, or you just search for what you're looking for and you're done.
And it's so quick. And yeah, again, yeah, I agree. A lot of them, like I'll start reading them, like the physical copies. I'm like, this feels nice. I really like this, and then I'll close it. I'll put it on the shelf. I tell all my friends I just got this new game, and then we open up PDFs and look at it from there. And then I never go back to it unless I'm like really like I want to be away from my computer right now. That's when I'll like really pick up the physical copies to
Yeah.
go and read.
Yeah, I it for me. So I use a tablet for my PDFs. I just have like it's almost full of them,
Oh,
so I can't get away from it. If I'm
you can just
sitting
take that
anywhere, if
wherever
I'm
you want.
lying somewhere, it's just there, and it's I can't say no. Oh, and especially in the last like 6 or 7 months, out of I've been in the community for like a year. I've
Mhm.
just there are so many now, so many indie titles that I just want to have and read and play and experience. Oh, it's beautiful. It's so cool.
It's so good. Yeah.
So good. Speaking of like indie TTRPGs and things like that, I've been playing TTRPGs for most of my life, in one form or another, although like 85% of that has been Dungeons and Dragons with a little bit of
Mhm.
like the World of Darkness games and stuff sort of peppered here and there. But
Mhm.
they've all been a lot like crunchier and more mechanical than the sort of mechanically narrative focused games that I've seen a lot more of in the time since joining this community. And
Mhm.
oh, between just hearing people talk about them and again, I'm going to bring it up, listening to like Strangers in the Woods, I have absolutely fallen in love with the entire sort of like style of it, and it's so fascinating and so beautiful, and it to me is something that speaks to kind of what I've done the last couple of years with D&D almost, where
Mhm.
combat has and like skills have become such a secondary thing to the narrative we're telling anyway. So
Yeah.
why aren't we playing games that are geared more towards that narrative? But I did want to ask what it is that sort of made you gravitate towards these games, and what it is that you love about them so much.
I mean, honestly, it's a lot of that same feeling, right? Like the last D&D campaign that I ran was last year, like I want to say like around February or March. And like it was about halfway through that game where I was really starting to get into like TTRPG TikTok and like all of that and like starting to like learn about all of these new other new games and such. That it was like halfway through that campaign where I realized like we're not even really playing D&D anymore. We All of my players were using a custom commoner class because all of them were like we were like, oh, we're going to do this whole thing where you eventually get to level 1 and then you choose your classes based on like the, we're essentially like playing out kind of their backstory a little
Yeah,
bit. But it was like halfway through that where I'm like, what, this isn't even D&D anymore. This straight up just isn't. We're not interacting with D&D whatsoever outside of monsters. But even those monsters, there was like a like I my last D&D campaign ended like February March of last year. Before that, I had another campaign. It was maybe like 6 months before that, somewhere there around, and at the like during that campaign, I stopped using stat blocks for monsters. Where I just started making them up because I was like, I've played this enough. I understand how these mechanics work enough where I could just make something up on the fly and it'll work fine. And then that's just what I started doing. And then as I was doing that and then starting to move away from the players even using a lot of D&D mechanics, there was a certain point where it just didn't matter anymore because the mechanics of D&D wasn't facilitating the experience that I was looking for. I was looking for ways for mechanics to interact with the narrative. I was looking for ways where what the characters were doing, I could give them a hard, okay, roll this, or you're doing X, Y needs to happen so we can find out what Z is. The, that's what I really needed. And I needed it to work within the narrative. And Dungeons and Dragons just does not have that. There's far too much reworking of Dungeons and Dragons that needs to happen in order for the mechanics of D&D to function within a narrative focus. And people can do it. But there was a certain point where I was just like, why not just play another game at this point? Because that's what I'm looking for. I'm looking for an experience that other games can bring me. So just I'll just play those other games. And yeah, like that was really the impetus for it. It was just like I'm I'm tired of not really getting the most out of the game that I'm playing right now and having to do all of this work to be able to actually get the experience I want. I'm just going to play a game that's going to give me that experience.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. That and it speaks to something I've seen a lot of on like Twitter over the last couple of months, where it's like, well, how much of a change do you make to D&D to make it the game you want it to be? And at what point should you just be like, why are you playing D&D?
Yeah.
What's the point? And I'm not trying to like down talk D&D. It does really well, I feel like. For the most
Mm-hmm.
part. It focuses in certain areas and it knocks those areas out of the park. But there's so many other things that you want to experience or that people want to experience, and like you said, it just doesn't lend itself to that. And
Yeah.
the literal hours that you spend trying to make it fit that box don't need to be spent because, like you said, there are games out there that will facilitate exactly what you're looking for, and it's
Mm-hmm.
absolutely brilliant.
Yeah. And it's like I understand what people get out of Dungeons and Dragons. You know, there, like you said, the things that it does, it tends to do very, very well, or at least well enough where people can inspires people to perhaps make new things that add on to that and make it exactly what they're looking for. And that's okay. It's just not what I want. Um, I don't want to do free labor for a multi-million dollar company to make the game playable for me. That's just not what I'm interested in.
Yeah, and again, I'm totally with you on that. I've said this a number of times on Twitter, and I think on one of these episodes before too, where fifth edition very much felt like here is the framework. We expect you, our audience, to build the rest of the game, and
I
it
mean,
never
that's
really changed throughout the whole lifespan.
I mean, you could even see it in what's. I don't even want to get into this, but you can see it like 100%. It is a game that is made to be a framework so other people can build on top of it, so that wizards can then monetize the work that other people do for them. It's what the
Exactly.
DMs Guild does. It's what D&D Beyond does. It's just what it does. That's the point.
Yep.
It's just making them more money, and that's like, what? No, I don't want to be a part of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And so even recently, I had this conversation with a friend of mine who wanted to start a new game, has a very specific character in mind, and it's like, okay, well, I have Dungeons and Dragons games that I'm a part of right now, both for like streaming. We have Dice Trays, a shameless plug. We have Dice Trays Action on
Blown away.
Tuesdays. We have Rega on Thursdays, and there are so many other games I want to try. I can't start another D&D game right now. I can't do it. And so
Mm-hmm.
then I had to sit down and I went, okay, well, what are other medieval fantasy games that will scratch a similar itch without having to be D&D? And a lot of the suggestions that I got back from people and thoughts that I had went back to these very crunchy systems that were still kind of in line with what D&D is doing. And it's like, well,
Mm-hmm.
all of these games make me go, why am I not just playing Dungeons and Dragons? I already know all the mechanics I need to do all the things I want. I know all the homebrews that I use to make it the way that I want to present it to my players. And at that point, I should just be playing that, but I don't want to. Well, what about other narrative games? And I was looking at like Dungeon World was one of the first ones that like I came to, and
Hmm.
I had already kind of been reading over some of these other like smaller indie titles that are also like powered by the apocalypse, and had really just had my mind blown by how different it is approaching these games. And I
Hmm.
realized that for myself, at least at first, I had no idea how to like make that shift because I
Hmm.
just spent my whole life being like, I'm gonna write this whole story. I'll make the shifts where I need to make the changes based on what they do. And that's just how it works. So now when the game is like, come up with a basic idea and then go. And your
Yeah.
players will figure out a lot of it. And you will be able to watch them and be like, this is what I need to do next. And it's just like, well, parts of this I was already doing, but also how do I implement it without having this whole like thing written? And it was so fascinating to me. It absolutely
Hmm.
was. Um, one of the other things that you brought up that I did want to talk a little bit about was you said you got started on like TikTok, right?
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
So TikTok, I have been really bad about TikTok. I get on it for a little while and then I'm not on it anymore and then I'm back on it. But one of the
Hmm.
things I consistently love about TikTok is I think it's called Beggar Talk, right? Is that I think that's what it's called? Where it's
Yes.
just like here are 100,000 games that aren't Dungeons and Dragons.
Yeah. Like so yeah, Beggar Talk is what got me into indie TTRPGs. My good friend now, Kirby, at Disaster Tourism, who now makes a bunch of a lot of like horror like indie TTRPGs, some solo, some like two players, some other very much a bunch of different kind of experiences. Please go check them out. They're amazing. And they're 100% like the reason I am here is because of Kirby. Kirby got me into Beggar Talk, which got me into indie TTRPGs, where we started making videos of like, hey, here are all of these other amazing games that you can be playing, and like trying to like explain like here's how you play them, here's how you make characters in them, like these are how these games work. Please go play them. Which had its ups and downs as far as the way that people engage with them, but you know, it's not terribly different from the way that TTRPG Twitter is in some ways. A lot of the same cycles, just separated from each other somehow.
Sure. That makes a lot of
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
sense. Yeah.
yeah,
Um so kind of one of the things that I mentioned a little bit and that you mentioned far more eloquently was how it's a very different experience running these games, like the indie,
hmm
like narratively driven, narratively focused games, from like how you present scenes to what you need or should even be writing out beforehand to the axes on which you sort of interact with your players. I was wondering if you could provide any like insight on running those more narratively driven games.
yeah. So God, I so Powered by the Apocalypse is my like favorite. It's technically not a system; it's a philosophy or whatever it is. But like Powered by the Apocalypse games are some of my favorite to run, specifically because every single little piece of a good Powered by the Apocalypse game is feeding into this idea of like narrative momentum. It is the narrative is always progressing in some way, shape, or form. And it does this by the merger of narrative, like narrative play and like combat play in a lot of ways, where games that do have combat, um or like let's say in Dungeons and Dragons, for example, D&D has two modalities, where the first one is this is narrative play. This is us role playing. This is just us talking to each other. You know, this is when everyone is in character doing the thing where they're, you know, going to stores, talking with NPCs, so on and so forth. And then the second modality is that of combat, you know, where you are heavily interacting with purely mechanics, at least like in its rawest form, right? Combat does not necessitate any kind of role play, any kind of engagement in like inter character decision making. It is purely about the situation at hand and how you're choosing to interact with it, as far as, are you attacking someone, are you moving, are you trying to flank someone. Like, it is all very interested in purely mechanics from a tactical standpoint. And these two modalities are separated with the common phrase roll for initiative, right? It is the switch that changes from this is narrative play to this is combat. Now, while you as a player or as a GM can like drip and like sprinkle character into that and narrative into that, um mechanically and raw, it is not supported. Not to say that there's anything in D&D that doesn't allow you to role play during combat, but there is no mechanic within the game that interacts with both what is happening in combat to what is happening narratively, if that makes sense, right? Where like you attacking, let's say your paladin who is like this ex Kingsguard fighting amongst all of your former colleagues, right? Trying to get to what you now know is the evil king or whatever. You going to attack a person that you like, these are my friends. Yeah, I'm slashing my sword. They're trying to fight me. We're all in this very intense, we're all in this very intense emotional state. That is your narrative for it, but there is no mechanic within D&D that supports any kind of interaction with what is happening physically with your character fighting and what is happening narratively between who you are fighting, right? And that is something that is very deeply in play with a lot of Powered by the Apocalypse games, right? With who has like who, depending on the game, let's say if you were playing like Masks or Thirsty Sword Lesbians, who has influence on strings on you, who you have an emotional connection with, can deeply impact how you play out combat. How, like, it can be the difference between you making a roll and you not making a roll to successfully hit someone, because someone who has influence on you can pull that string, affect you narratively, and also affect you mechanically, what you're doing in that combat. It is also not separated by the rolling of initiative, right? Combat and narrative are always seamed together. They are never apart. You are never at any point in a properly run, good Powered by the Apocalypse game. It should you should be in the you should always be playing your character as you are initiating combat, as you're doing any action. That is why it's very explicitly said in a lot of Powered by the Apocalypse game, you never speak the move that you're doing. You just say what you're doing. And it's up for the game master. It's up for you to go. I take out my sword and I swing at Sir Reginald. And it's up for the game master to be like, okay, this sounds like you're trying to initiate hack and slash, depending on the game.
Right.
You know, you're doing your attack. Or this just could be easily where they could say that, like, no, I'm actually trying to parlay with them. I'm trying to get like an emotional, like I'm trying to bargain with them to work with me, but I'm doing this like in combat, right? That is like so much more interesting and engaging to me in a way, because the actual mechanics of the game not just allow it to happen, but enforces it. It incites it. It wants you to do that. It wants every single action that you're doing to be so purely within what your character would do and how it affects the narrative because you've done it. And that is like my favorite thing about narrative specific games, but specifically right now, about Powered by the Apocalypse. I rambled. I told you I would. It happened.
That was not rambling. That was absolutely beautiful and so well put. Honestly, it captured everything that I've felt thus far reading through these games. And one thing that I'd love to add to that is
Mhm.
with games like Dungeons and Dragons, like you said, when you're in combat, you kind of lose a lot of the flavor. And no matter how hard you try, because you can interject a lot of that flavor, there's still so much outside of the mind of your character that you have to exist in for the mechanical tactics. And it almost feels like the game incentivizes the continuation of combat instead of those moments of narrative clarity where you're like, there are things I can do that would make more narrative sense than just casting fireball or swinging my sword around. But this is the mode of Dungeons and Dragons we are in now, and so this is what I'm supposed to be doing. And a lot of the time,
Mhm.
I've seen that, and even like I used to run games at stores many years ago, where I talk to people afterwards just to get an idea of why do you make the decisions you make, because I love that part of like character building. It's like,
Yeah.
well, I attacked. I was fighting because that's what we were doing. We were in combat. We rolled initiative. We started combat, so we were supposed to be in combat. And it was such a now years later, having looked over these like powered by the apocalypse games, it's such an eye
Mhm.
opening experience to be like, well, here's something that very clearly lays out for you that that doesn't have to or even should be the way that it goes. And I love that so
Yeah,
much.
absolutely.
I've been today. I had some time. I was starting to read over Sixth World, which is
Whoa.
like Shadowrun,
Yeah.
but powered by
Oh,
the
yeah, yeah, yeah,
apocalypse.
yeah.
I
Mhm.
have many thoughts on Shadowrun, which we'll save for another episode. But
Same.
you want to talk about Crunch, um, but so I'm like, I love the setting and I love the guys.
Well, the Shadowrun was one of the few non D&D games that we played when I was in high school, and we could not run it without Chummer because it
Yep.
was the literally the only way you could actually have a character sheet and know what was going on. Because also the
Yes.
game's character sheet is not big enough for the game. It's
No.
not big enough. There's so much. There's so much you have to have written down, and it's like a one-page sheet with like this much space to write all of your equipment, all of your like if you were like the fighter like the kind of like monkish like fighter one where you
The
had like
Adept.
psychic, yeah, if you had like
Yep.
the adept or like any like if you wanted to be like have any kind of drone or anything, forget it. You're not writing it on that sheet of paper. There's not enough space.
Yep. The first time we tried it, we had a Decker, and so the whole back of their character sheet was just written out different like cyberware they had to have and software that they had access to, and it was like, come on.
No, no, no.
Yeah. And then
Chummer
you
is the only way that game works.
yeah, yeah. And then you put it together with a rule book that doesn't always do a great job of separating flavor from mechanics. And when the game is really mechanic heavy, that becomes a problem.
Mm-hmm.
But I love the setting. I love the concept. Cyberpunk is so cool. And then also taking like the magic and the fantasy like peoples and injecting them into it is beautiful.
So good.
So finding this game, I was like, this is something I've needed in my life for years.
Right.
And it's one of the first powered by the apocalypse games that does have like a pretty heavy like presentation of combat in it that's beyond like there is a move you can do to attack, you can take a harm, and that's kind of a lot of it. Whereas this
Mhm.
has a little more nuance to it and still manages to not push you into that, well, fighting is fighting and you have to become mechanical and number oriented. And
Mhm.
oh, the breath that I let out.
Right. Oh, that's so good. I'm gonna have to check it out. You said it's Sixth World?
Yeah, yeah. I forget who it's by. I will both put the information below the video and I'll send it to you
Okay. All right.
afterwards. But yeah, it is great. And I've just been on such a kick going through all these different Powered by the Apocalypse games now. Uh,
Mhm.
so the next thing I would love to ask you about is what was the incentive or incentive is the wrong word. What led you to decide you wanted to start making this content for an audience?
So I in college, both like late high school and college, I have like a 5 year history in improv comedy and long form improv comedy specifically. And it, especially during the periods of time where like I wasn't able to like consistently play like tabletop games, really continued to fuel my like love of like collaborative storytelling, of like being with other people telling a story together. And it also like is a performance, right? I'm doing it in front of people, and it I've always wanted to do that with tabletop games, right? As soon as I learned that, like as soon as like I started actually understanding like what actual play is, getting into the Adventure Zone, getting into, I think like the first one I listened to was this podcast called Drunkards and Dragons, which I think was a fourth. I believe it started off as a fourth edition D&D podcast. I don't know if it still is. But like do like stuff like that, and then eventually getting into like Dimension 20 and getting into a NAD pod, and like getting in and like Friends at the Table, and like getting into like all of these different shows really like incited this urge in me. It was like, I want to also make this kind of content. I want to tell stories with my friends and share them with people. And like, yeah, no, that was like really the thing. I kind of I wanted to do it, but I knew if I did it, I didn't want to just make another one, right? As like someone who's like I went to college for like digital storytelling and like audio storytelling and filmmaking, and I primarily acted as like a screenwriter for like every project that I've ever like filmed, and like so there was this like urge in me that was like, if I'm going to do something, I want to make something that's A, uniquely my own, and then B, not just, I don't want to just make it to be making it, right? Like like I believe that there is a value in someone making art just to make art. And uh but I also feel like in our space, specifically the podcasting space, that is so accessible to the degree where literally anyone with a microphone and an internet connection can make a podcast. And there, because of it, there are hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds of actual play podcasts. And that's truly an amazing thing. But it also means that there are a lot of them that are very much the same. Um, we can not there are not probably not enough human fingers in the world to count the amount of D&D actual play podcasts that are just five cis white straight dudes who are hanging out around their table chewing on munchies and playing out in some like Eurocentric medieval fantasy world, right?
Yep.
There's so many of them, and so that's why I really wanted to be very intentional about, okay, I want to play indie tabletop RPGs because there's so many good ones, and there are not a lot of podcasts out there that are playing them in a way that feels like, whenever I go to try to find a new like tabletop game to play, or every time I do find one of the first things I try to do is I try to find an actual play stream, podcast, whatever, that is playing that game so I can listen or watch it and I can learn how to play the game. Because the context of seeing how other people have delineated on how rules should be handled and how people interact with the mechanics given just helps give you context of being like, oh, this is how I play this, and then this is how I get into it. It's one of the big reasons why Dungeons and Dragons is as big as it is because there's so many resources to help teach people how to play the game and facilitate a newcomer into playing it. But there aren't a lot of there aren't a lot of that for most indie tabletop RPGs. So I knew if I wanted to make stuff, I was going to focus in on that, not only to help distinguish myself from a podcast that didn't, but also as a tool so people like me who would be going out looking for new games can have a place to actually look at and be like, oh, this is how I play this game. I'm going to use this to help play other games, right? Um, and I also knew that like and this comes from my own personal like um, uh, uh, love of like the stuff that I make is that I'm a huge fan of twisting genres and twisting expectations and tropes and such like that. And I really knew it was like if I was going to do this, I wanted to make sure that everything I did was as weird as possible and as like genre bendy as possible and as like I like essentially I tell my cast every time we have a new season, tell me what the thing is, but tell me what makes this different from what we would expect the story to be about. And that's like a very like core thing that I like. That's a core philosophy that I have for Tales Yet Told is that we want to tell stories, even like stories that are somewhat familiar, in as new and twisted of a way as possible. And that was like, yeah, my main reasoning for wanting to do this, just because I think there should be more weird content out there, and I think there should be more content that helps introduce people to new games and new systems and such.
I love that. That's awesome. Also, I will bring it up again. Um, you have absolutely succeeded because the content is so good. The things that you play and the way that it's presented really do such a great job of getting across the way that the games can be handled and can be presented both at like private tables and even as actual plays. I mean, I think I already said it. I know I already said it. I have picked up a lot of how I see and try to run Powered by the Apocalypse games based on how I have heard you run your games because it's so good.
That is the highest compliment I can get because that's truly why I did it. So I'm happy that again I will continue to say it. I'm happy that it is giving you that kind of value.
And I think unfortunately we are coming up on our like sort of end time here. Um
Ah, tragic.
I know I wish we could sit here all night. I really do. Do
Yeah,
you have
yeah.
any like closing thoughts that you would or things you would want to put out there or
Oh geez. Go listen to my podcast.
I can co-sign this. Um,
Yeah. Hey, if you're out there and you're wanting to make stuff, do it. You know, make the kind of content that you want to see out there in the world. I know that's cliche and everyone says it, but it really is true. If you want something to exist in the world and you are looking for it and you don't see it, hell, even if you do see it and it's not what you would specifically want, make it. There's nothing there. The world is only going to be better because you did, because you have value to give in your existence purely just because you're here. And anything that you are willing to offer to this world as a creative endeavor, as a part of sharing part of yourself and the things that you care about in this world, do it. That's justification enough to do it.
yeah, love it. And I think that's just about going to do it for this episode. Again, thank you so much for being here because this has been such an absolute treat for me. Uh,
Thank you for inviting me.
I I am more than pleased to have been able to do it. You can find out more about Kendo and Tales Yet Told over on Twitter, which will be linked below. Um, I'm hoping to start a new tradition with this episode of Roll for Perspective. So I was wondering if you'd be willing to sort of narrate or GM us out.
Yeah, no, yeah, I can do that. I'm trying. Okay, I got to figure out what it means to narrate. Do you want me to narrate a scene as that gets us out, or just like
Sure.
Okay. Oh, jeez. Okay.
It's a bit of an act.
Ah. Okay. Sorry, I just gotta reacclimate my brain here really quick.
No worries.
I'm in a bit of a piratey mood, so it might lean in that direction
Let's
if
do it.
that's
Let's get as
okay.
piratey as
Okay.
you want.
And as the camera zooms away through the porthole window on the side of this massive ship carving its way through the murky waters of the seemingly endless ocean, pulling far back away until the ship is but a silhouette on the horizon, shadowed by the sun in front of it, going into whatever adventure lies ahead of it. When we pull back even further, deep beneath the ocean below it, into its dark depths, until there is nothing that can be seen. Only a whisper of the water around us and its cold, briny embrace. And then there is nothing. Goodbye. That's it. That's the end of it.